Beloved, today I come to you with a message that may shake your soul but set your spirit free. The Spirit of the Lord has stirred within me a deep urgency, for I see a generation praying for freedom while feasting on bondage. We cry for power, for clarity, for victory. But what if the very things we put upon our plates are the tools the enemy uses to steal our strength, our focus, our fire? There are three foods, three deadly temptations that the devil uses not to nourish but to numb, not to satisfy but to enslave. The human body is not merely flesh and blood. It is a divine vessel designed to host the presence of God. When the Creator formed man, He breathed His Spirit into him, and that breath made humanity sick. Our bodies were never meant to be ruled by cravings or corrupted by carelessness. They were meant to glorify the one who dwells within. Every cell, every heartbeat, and every breath carries a purpose far higher than pleasure or indulgence. When we understand that the body is the temple of the Spirit, we begin to treat it not as a playground of desires, but as a sanctuary of divine power. The tragedy of our age is that many people have forgotten this truth. They live as if their bodies belong to them, feeding on whatever pleases their taste and ignoring what pollutes their spirit. But when we feed this temple with things that defile it, we silence the voice of the Spirit within. The devil knows this, and that is why he constantly tempts humanity to desecrate the holy vessel God has entrusted to us. The enemy understands that if he can influence what you put into your body, he can dull your sensitivity to the Spirit. Every time you yield to the wrong appetite, you make your temple a place where confusion, weakness, and spiritual blindness can dwell. God designed your body to carry His glory, yet the devil tries to make it carry guilt, addiction, and disease. He cannot occupy what is pure, so he corrupts it through what you consume. What you eat, what you drink, what you allow to enter your body is more than a physical act. It is a spiritual choice. The foods you consume determine what spirit you invite to rule your vessel. Some foods strengthen your clarity, focus, and discipline. Others drain your energy, cloud your judgment, and make your heart restless. When the Spirit of God dwells in you, He calls you to treat your body as holy ground. But holiness demands awareness. You cannot live in divine power while feeding on things that defy divine order. The enemy thrives in ignorance, and his greatest victory is when you see your body as ordinary. Yet your body is extraordinary. It is the visible structure of an invisible purpose. When you neglect it, you weaken your ability to carry out what God has called you to do. When you respect it, you create space for heaven's power to move freely through you. The purity of your vessel determines the clarity of your vision, and the discipline of your appetite determines the strength of your spirit. Many people kneel in prayer, crying out for deliverance, yet unknowingly feel the very forces that keep them bound. They ask God to break their chains, but continue nurturing the habits, thoughts, and appetites that forged those chains in the first place. Deliverance is not only about what you reject in prayer, but also about what you refuse to feed in life. The enemy is cunning. He doesn't always appear as darkness. Sometimes he hides within what seems normal, harmless, or even pleasurable. When a person continues to indulge in the things that weaken their spirit, they make it harder for divine freedom to take root. You cannot be free from what you continue to sustain. Every time you partake of something that feeds your bondage, you are strengthening the very thing you pray to escape. There are people who fast and pray, yet their minds remain clouded, their emotions unsettled, their willpower broken. The reason is not always a lack of faith, it is often a lack of awareness. When you feed your spirit with worldly noise, your discernment fades. The devil walks through these patterns because he knows your consumption determines your in the beginning. Man's downfall did not come through a sword, a battle, or a visible enemy, but through what he ate. The entire story of humanity's separation from divine perfection began with an act of consumption. In the Garden of Eden, everything was provided in abundance. Every tree was good for food, and every need was satisfied. Yet the enemy focused Eve's attention on the one thing God had forbidden. It was not hunger that led to sin, but disobedience disguised as appetite. The fruit looked harmless, even beautiful. It was pleasing to the eye, desirable to make one wise, but beneath its sweetness lay rebellion. Through that single act of eating, man exchanged spiritual dominion for carnal desire. And since then, the devil has never changed his method. He understood that if he could influence what man consumes, he could influence what man becomes. Food became a symbol of choice, of loyalty, of alignment. That bite in eating was more than a physical act. It was a declaration of independence from divine order. It represented the moment when humanity chose to feed on what pleased the flesh rather than what honored the spirit. The devil did not need to destroy humanity by force. He simply redirected their appetite. And from that moment on, the struggle between the flesh and the spirit began. Every temptation that followed in history carries the same. The enemy's strategy has remained the same since the beginning of time. He may change his methods, but his purpose never shifts: to manipulate desire, distort truth, and enslave the will of man through appetite. What he used in the Garden of Eden, he still uses today. He tempted Eve with a fruit that appeared harmless and desirable. He tempted Esau with a bowl of stew that cost him his birthright. He tempted Jesus in the wilderness with bread to turn his hunger into rebellion. In every generation, the devil studies human appetite because he knows that appetite is the gateway to influence. He does not need to overthrow the mind of a believer if he can first conquer their cravings. Appetite governs focus, focus governs decisions, and decisions shape destiny. The enemy understands that if he can control what you desire, he can determine what you become. The manipulation of appetite is not always about food. It is about anything that promises satisfaction but produces separation from God. The devil's goal is to convince you that immediate pleasure is worth more than eternal purpose. He whispers that you deserve it, that one taste won't matter, that you can always repent later. He presents sinners sweetness and hides the bitterness until it is too late. The more you feed the wrong appetite, the stronger it grows until it demands obedience. What began as a choice becomes a compulsion, and what once seemed harmless becomes a prison. The devil does not rush this process. He waits patiently as you build your own chains, one indulgence at a time. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he showed us how to defeat the manipulation. The devil knows that if he can control your appetite, he can control your mind. Appetite is not just the desire for food, it is the longing for satisfaction, for pleasure, for comfort. It is the inner voice that drives you to seek fulfillment, whether through what you eat, what you watch, what you crave, or what you pursue. The mind follows the direction of desire. When the appetite is purified, the mind is focused. But when the appetite is corrupted, the mind becomes confused. This is why the enemy always targets appetite first, because what you hunger for determines what occupies your thoughts. A distracted mind is easier to deceive than a disciplined one. The devil feeds the body so that he can starve the spirit, and when the spirit is starved, the mind becomes his playground. Every bite of these poisonous foods affects more than your health. It affects your holiness. There are things you consume that dull your discernment, weaken your conviction, and make you comfortable with what seems pleasurable for a moment can produce bondage for a lifetime. The devil never tempts you with pain. He always begins with pleasure. He knows that humanity is drawn to comfort, sweetness, and ease. He offers a moment of delight, a taste of satisfaction, a glimpse of relief, but behind that moment hides a trap that tightens with time. The first experience feels harmless, even rewarding, but every repetition builds a chain. The sweetness fades, yet the craving remains, and what once felt like freedom begins to feel like slavery. The devil understands the weakness of human desire, so he does not rush the process. He feeds you slowly, softly, consistently, until you no longer realize you are being controlled. Pleasure is not evil in itself, for God created joy, rest, and satisfaction. But when pleasure becomes the master of the servant, it transforms into bondage. The enemy twists what God designed for refreshment into an instrument of control. He disguises captivity as comfort. He whispers, "You deserve this," until the appetite overpowers the will. Soon the thing that once brought pleasure begins to demand obedience. The battle for your soul often begins at the table of temptation. The enemy does not always appear with threats or weapons. Sometimes he comes as a host offering a meal. He knows that what you accept from his table becomes part of you. Every temptation is an invitation to eat, an invitation to consume something that looks good, feels right, but carries death beneath its surface. The table represents the place of decision, the moment where desire and obedience collide. From the Garden of Eden to the wilderness where Jesus was tempted, Every major battle for dominion began not with violence, but with appetite. The enemy sets the table carefully, decorating it with things that appeal to the senses, but his goal is not to feed you, it is to enslave you. At this table, the food is not always physical. Sometimes it is the food of pride, where you are tempted to believe you can live without divine guidance. Sometimes it is the food of fear, feeding your doubts until you stop trusting God's promises. Other times it is the food of distraction, where constant indulgence robs you of focus and drains your spiritual fire. The devil's table is always appealing because some foods silence your spirit's voice and amplify your carnal desires. They appear harmless to the senses but deadly to the soul. The spirit speaks in stillness, but the flesh shouts through craving, and whichever voice you feed becomes the one that rules you. When you continually satisfy the demands of your body and ignore the needs of your spirit, you make your inner world noisy, cluttered, and restless. The devil understands this imbalance and uses it to his advantage. He keeps people busy feeding the flesh so that the spirit remains weak and unheard. Every indulgence that dulls your sensitivity to God is not just a habit, it is a strategy of spiritual warfare. When the spirit is silent, discernment fades. You cannot walk in divine authority while being ruled by earthly cravings. Authority in the spirit in the spiritual realm comes from alignment, and alignment requires mastery over desire. When a person is controlled by appetite, whether for food, comfort, validation, or pleasure, they lose the clarity and strength that flow from divine obedience. God cannot fully entrust power to someone who is still enslaved by the impulses of the flesh because authority demands discipline. And the devil understands this principle and works tirelessly to keep believers in bondage to their cravings. He knows that a person may have faith, may pray passionately, and may even speak words of truth. But if they are still governed by desire, their authority remains limited. Spiritual authority is not measured by how loudly one prays, but by how deeply one is surrendered. Cravings are the chains that tie the soul to the ground. When you allow the body to dictate what the spirit should do, you reduce your divine potential to human limits. The flesh always seeks comfort, while the spirit seeks purpose. Every time you yield to an earthly craving at the cost of obedience, you trade eternal strength for temporary pleasure. The enemy rejoices when he sees believers powerful in word but powerless in will, because he knows they cannot command what they still serve. You cannot cast out what you secretly feed. You cannot speak against darkness when you still dine at its table. Divine authority flows through purity, and purity is sustained by self-control. To command the forces of darkness, you must first conquer the impulses within. The moment you master your cravings, discipline in what you consume is the foundation of spiritual power. Every act of restraint strengthens your authority, while every indulgence weakens your dominion. The body, the mind, and the spirit were never meant to operate independently. They are designed to serve one another in divine harmony. But when discipline is absent, the order is reversed. The flesh begins to lead, the mind becomes clouded, and the spirit grows faint. The devil knows that a person without discipline cannot carry lasting power. He fears the one who has control over appetite, because such a person cannot be manipulated through desire. Discipline builds resistance against temptation. It teaches the heart to obey the spirit instead of emotion. Without it, even the most anointed person becomes vulnerable to defeat. True discipline is not about denial for its own sake, but about alignment with divine order. It is the conscious decision to choose what nourishes your destiny over what merely satisfies your desire. When you discipline your consumption, what you eat, what you watch, you listen to, and what you entertain, you purify your atmosphere. The spirit within you becomes sharper, your thoughts clearer, your prayers deep. A disciplined life invites divine presence because God dwells in order, not chaos. Every time you say no to your flesh, your spirit grows stronger. Every time you restrain from excess, you create room for divine wisdom to flow. Discipline is not a punishment, it is preparation for power. Those who lack discipline often wonder why they struggle to hear God's voice or walk in consistent victory. It is because the noise of indulgence drowns out the whisper of the Spirit. When your life is cluttered with excess, heaven's frequency becomes faint. Discipline clears the space where revelation can dwell. It teaches patience, focus, and endurance, qualities that the enemy cannot corrupt. The devil tempts the undisciplined easily because they live by impulse. but he fears the disciplined because they live by purpose. Discipline is the wall that guards your anointing and the shield that protects your purity. Every great move of God begins with a disciplined vessel. Before miracles manifest outwardly, mastery must first occur inward. When you gain control over what enters your body and mind, you reclaim dominion over what governs your life. Spiritual authority is not a gift randomly given. It is cultivated through consistent restraint. The disciplined are not swayed by every temptation because heaven's strength flows through a purified vessel, not one enslaved by indulgence. God desires to pour his power into lives that are clean, steady, and surrendered. Purity is not perfection. It is separation from anything that contaminates your divine purpose. When the vessel is polluted, even the purest oil loses its fragrance. The Spirit of God cannot dwell fully in a heart that is divided between holiness and habit. The more the vessel is cleansed, the more freely divine power can move through it. The devil knows this truth, and that is why he constantly tempts people to defile themselves, not necessarily with great sins, but with small daily indulgences that accumulate like dust upon the soul. A polluted vessel may still function, but it cannot carry glory. It may speak the right words, but those words the fire that transforms. Purification begins with awareness. You cannot cleanse what you refuse to confront. Every indulgence, every compromise, every unguarded appetite becomes a stain that dulls your spiritual sensitivity. The power of heaven cannot rest where the heart is bound to the pleasures of the world. Many pray for anointing but neglect cleansing. They ask for fire but ignore the ashes within. Yet God's power is always attracted to purity because purity reflects his nature. When the vessel is pure, the flow of the Spirit is effortless. The miracles of old, the visions, the authority, they were not results of giftedness alone, but of consecration. The process of purification often feels painful because it strips away the layers of comfort that the flesh clings, but every act of surrender draws heaven closer. When you let go of indulgence, you make space for presence. The less the world fills you, the more God can. The purified vessel becomes a channel of divine strength. Its words carry weight, its prayers carry power, and its life to conquer the devil's control, you must first conquer your appetite. Every battle for spiritual authority begins within. The enemy does not gain dominion through force. He gains it through desire. When your appetite is ungoverned, he has an entry point into your soul. The devil studies what you crave because what you crave reveals what you can be controlled by. If he can make you chase satisfaction more than sanctification, you will obey him without realizing it. The true mark of spiritual maturity is not how loudly you pray, but how deeply you restrain yourself. Victory over the devil is not achieved by emotion but by discipline. Until you master your hunger, you will always bow to what pleases the flesh rather than what empowers the spirit. Appetite is not evil, but when it becomes your master, it becomes your prison. God created desire so that you would long for his presence, his truth, and his... The enemy perverts that desire, redirecting it toward things that offer temporary pleasure but eternal emptiness. Every temptation is designed to awaken an appetite that leads you away from divine order. That is why the path to freedom begins with mastery over your craving. When you say no to the flesh, you say yes to heaven. The more you discipline your appetite, the less control the enemy has over your thoughts, emotions, and decisions. True deliverance is not only about casting out evil influences. It is about removing the fuel that keeps them alive. The power of a believer flows through self-control. A person who has conquered appetite cannot be manipulated by temptation. Fasting, prayer, and purity are not just spiritual exercises. They are acts of warfare. They silence the demands of the body so the voice of the spirit can lead. When your appetites are under submission, you no longer live as a victim of desire, but as a vessel of dominion. The devil cannot influence a person who's hungered in God. Every time you resist the urge to feed the flesh, your authority in the spirit realm grows. Conquering appetite is not about denial. It is about alignment. When you are no longer ruled by what your body wants, you are free to follow what your spirit needs. In that mastery lies your victory. Because the moment you gain control over appetite, you close the gate through which the devil once